project that we're going to work on today is this bunny wrap project that I designed. So I'm going to show you how I've got the fabric prepared and how I've hooped the fabric, and then I'm going to stitch it out and you can follow along as I stitch the project out. Okay, so I've gone ahead and cut my long length of white fabric. I have put my SF101 interfacing on the back of this piece of fabric, and that is what I've used here. If you prefer, you can use any kind of a woven adhesive interfacing to the back of this. I really like to do that because it gives that fabric a bit more stability for when I'm stitching it out on my embroidery machine. I've also gone ahead and cut my quilt batting to the same size as I've got my white piece of fabric. And then I've got my stabilizer that I'm going to be hooping into my hoop. This here is a no-show mesh. It is a lightweight, somewhat flexible stabilizer. What I like about this is that it is machine washable without it taking and getting warped or maybe disintegrating. Like if you use a tearaway, as you wash a tearaway, it kind of dissolves somewhat and it can leave little pieces in between the layers of material. So this is a no-show mesh that I like to use. Then I've got my pieces for my applique cut. The pieces here is going to be for my body. This is going to be for the arm, legs, and ears, and this piece is going to be for the inside of the ears. Now what I've done with these pieces is I've added one layer of my SF101 interfacing, just again to help give that fabric more stability. Then I've also added on the back of these pieces a layer of my heat and bond, so that way when it's time I can fuse these applique pieces to this piece. And one reason I also use that heat and bond is I like to use a blanket stitch on my design, and so that can help to keep the edges from fraying when I've trimmed my edges down. So on the back side is got the interfacing that's fused on, and then on top of that it has the heat and bond fused on. So next what we're going to do is go ahead and hoop our stabilizer. Do not cut your stabilizer to the same width as these other pieces because you may cut it too small and it may not fit in the width of your hoop. So just cut the length of your stabilizer to your project piece. So I'm going to go ahead and hoop my stabilizer now. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and hoop our stabilizer. What I've done is I've just folded it in half. Find the center point markings on your hoop and then just open up your stabilizer. Take the other half of your hoop and place it on top and push it down in place, making sure you've got equal portions of material on each side. Then you're going to go ahead and screw the nut down. You want to screw it tightly but not over tightly, because this will then make sure that your stabilizer is secure. And you want to make sure that this is nice and flat and somewhat taut. You don't want this to be loose at all. So if you need to, pull it up on the edges at this point to make sure it's nice and flat and secure and that your hoop is pressed down into place. Then you want to find the center point on your fabric. So what I did was I folded my fabric in half, then I used a ruler to find the center point here, and then I used my Frixion pen. I don't know if that can get that in focus or not, but it's a Frixion pen that when you hit it with an iron, the heat will make that ink disappear. So then with my batting and my fabric together, I'm going to center that. So you can find that center point, that marking here, in here, and center this down into place. And then we're going to pin this just in a couple of spots to hold it. So I've got a couple of pins here. You want to make sure though that you don't put the pins too close to the sides here, because the machine is going to do a stitching to secure that fabric to the stabilizer, and we don't want the needle of our machine to hit your pin. So I'm just going to pin it like that, and then we'll go to the machine and start stitching out our design. These are the arrows that I'm talking about on your machine. You could use these arrows here. This is to center your design. This is to move it to the right or left or up or down. So that will allow you to move your hoop if necessary. Now we're going to go ahead and start stitching out our design. The first thing it will stitch will be some stitches along each side to hold our materials in place. I am going to use a gray thread just so that it'll show up on the camera. I would recommend you use a thread color that matches the fabric that you have chosen, so that when you go to sew your project together, that thread will be in the seam allowance and should not show then. You need to hold your fabric in place. Use a stick or something like a chopstick so that you don't pinch your fingers in there. Stitch up the other side now, so you can make sure, well, take that pin out, make sure that your fabric is nice and taut. Now we're ready to start our first applique piece. The layers of the design are going to show up on the panel on your machine. The first thing we're going to stitch is the placement stitch. That placement stitch will indicate where you'll be placing your fabric that will then be stitched into place. If you skip this and just try to guess where the fabric is going to stitch, you may lay your fabric in the incorrect place. So let's put our placement stitch down. So this is going to be the back layer for the first ear. We can take and pull our hoop out a little bit so you can see that. Now we're going to go ahead and lay our fabric into place. You can cut your fabric to fit just that particular size, or cut it a little bigger and then manipulate the fabric so that it's going to lay on top of the placement stitch. Just make sure that your fabric extends beyond up here, in here, and all around, so that the fabric will be completely enclosed in your stitching. So we're going to lay this down, check that we've got it in a good place. And then if I like where I've got my fabric, I'm going to place this hoop back into position. And I can see that that might come a little out of place there. Take the time to check it, and then we're going to stitch this down into place. Now you can remove this from the hoop, and then you're going to use either kind of pair of applique cutting scissors and cut the fabric close to the stitching line without cutting the stitches. So I'm going to trim this and be right back. As you can see, I have trimmed my fabric around my stitching there, and because I do have that heat and bond or any other type of fusible applique material that you've applied to the back of your fabric, I'm at this point going to go ahead and use my iron to press that into place to activate the glue to hold it to the material, and also to help it keep from the fabric edges fraying. So it doesn't take but a few seconds to press that down into place. And then we're ready to go ahead and put our hoop back into our machine, and it will then stitch whatever stitching design is programmed. For this one, it's going to have a blanket stitch. You could even have one that has a satin stitch finish to go around the edge. Okay, I've got my materials placed back into my hoop. So let's go ahead and stitch the next stitching segment. Okay, I've got my blanket stitch stitched for that. The next step is going to be the inside part of the ear, which I'm using pink fabric, so I'm going to change my thread color to a pink that will coordinate with that piece of fabric. So I'm going to change my thread color now, and we'll be back. Okay, I've got my pink thread into my machine, so let's stitch our placement stitch. Okay, now I'm ready to go ahead and lay my piece of fabric down in place to stitch it into place. And I've got a loose thread here. We're going to trim that a little. Get my fabric laid down. And we're ready to stitch this into place now. Now I'm going to remove my hoop. I'm going to trim the fabric around here, and then I'm going to use my iron to go ahead and press that down in place, because I do have some heat and bond on the back of this, and then I'll come back and we'll stitch the finishing stitch around the edge of this. Let's go ahead and do the finishing blanket stitch around the outside edge. Got one ear finished. We're ready to do the second ear. I'm going to change my thread color back to the gray color to match the gray fabric that I'm going to be placing down. Okay, I've got my gray thread on my machine. Let's stitch out the next ear. That was the placement stitch that we needed, so we know where we're going to place our next piece of fabric. I'm going to pull this out just a little bit. And we'll lay our fabric down in place and make sure that it extends around where it needs to so that it's all going to get stitched. Let's put that back in place. To remove this from the hoop, trim my fabric around the stitching without cutting the stitching, and go ahead and press down my heat and bond to adhere to the base of the material. Okay, we've got our fabric trimmed and heated in place. We're ready to go ahead and do our blanket stitch around the edging. Let's do our placement stitch for the inner part of our ear with our pink thread. Okay, we're ready to lay our fabric down into place and stitch it down. same as we did with the other ear, we're going to trim around the outside edge and then press our applique piece into place and come back and finish with the blanket stitch. Time to get that blanket stitch stitched in place. We are going to continue to repeat the same process of putting a placement stitch, laying our fabric into place and stitching our fabric into place, trimming our fabric and heating the piece of fabric down, and then doing the finishing stitch of either a blanket stitch or a satin stitch. So you just continue to repeat those steps with each applique piece. The next piece we're going to be putting into place is one of the legs at the bottom of our bunny. So I'm going to change my thread color and we'll work on the next part. Here we go with our placement stitch. And lay our fabric down into place. I'm going to move this pin out just so I don't accidentally do anything incorrect with that pin. Got our fabric into place and let's stitch it down. Going to trim it and heat it and we'll be right back. Time to add our finishing stitch on. Now we are ready to stitch the placement stitch for the bunny body part. Now it's time to go ahead and lay the fabric on top of the placement stitch. Stitch the fabric into place. I'm going to go ahead and trim the fabric, and then I'm going to heat it up so that heat and bond then fuses to the back fabric. I have trimmed my fabric up. I have pressed it into place. I'm now ready to go ahead and stitch my blanket stitch. Okay, we've got the blanket stitch done around the body. The next step we will be doing will be to stitch the right arm in place, the left arm in place, and the other leg into place. I am not going to film doing each one of these steps. This way here we can keep the video at a reasonable length. So go ahead and follow the steps on your machine to do the right, the left arm, and then the bottom leg. I have finished up stitching the arms and the other leg onto this project. Now what the next stitching is going to be is a outline border around the whole project. I'm going to stitch that out with a white thread. You could choose a contrasting thread of something else if you want. On your screen for your machine, it may show a creamy yellow color, so that the image will show up. When I tell it to put it in white, a lot of times you can't see what the image is that it's going to stitch. So let's go ahead and stitch this outline. And then we should be ready to start stitching the eye and the whiskers and mouth onto the project. So I need to change thread colors. Okay, let's go ahead and get the eye and the whiskers and the mouth stitched into place. I now have a pretty pink thread that I'm going to use for stitching the nose. Now what we're going to start working on are the flowers and the grass area. So we're going to stitch one of the flowers that the bunny is holding. So I'm going to switch to a bluish teal colored thread. I am ready to go ahead and start stitching my flower. I did design this so that it will stitch the flower on top of itself a second time because it's not a very dense stitching, and I wanted it to just be a little denser than it was when it only stitched it with one layer of thread. Let's go ahead and start this. Okay, let's go ahead and get started stitching our leaves out. I'm going to go ahead and now switch my thread out to a black thread to stitch the rest of the design for this flower. Let's go to the next step. next step is going to be to stitch the center of the flower. So pick a color of thread that you want to use for the center of your flower. So now what we're going to do is go ahead and stitch the grass part at the bottom. So find a nice pretty green that you want to use for the grass part. Okay, what we have left now to stitch out are the flowers here and the cute little swirly parts and the stems and our butterfly. I'm just going to go ahead and stitch them out. I'm not going to keep starting and stopping and explaining each piece that I'm doing. So just go ahead and follow the prompts that are here on the side and stitch out the rest of the design, and then we'll go to the next step on how to work at assembling our project. Okay, so I was having some difficulty with my thread stitching and shredding and not cutting properly. I started cleaning and I'm getting this dust out of here. So I've got this little thing that you actually like use for cleaning your teeth with, like to get food particles out between your teeth. And it works good too for picking up lint in your machine. So I took the plates off, and between the feed dogs there's a lot of lint. And then one reason my thread wasn't cutting is because there is a bunch of little loose pieces of thread next to my thread cutter. So if you can't get it with some kind of a thing that can pick up some lint and stuff, use some tweezers even. And there's just loose threads that are down in here and some lint that's down in here, causing my thread to not cut and my machine to not stitch properly. So once in a while you have to take it apart and clean down inside. You can take your bobbin out, and down in this area here, take something and run it around. I did this earlier so it's not real dusty, but you get a lot of lint built up in there. See, here's a loose thread. So you'll get some loose threads and debris in here that can affect how well your machine might be cutting or stitching. So yeah, if you have to, take a pause and clean that out, because you don't always have to send your machine to the shop. There's some basic cleaning you can do yourself. So if you've gotten this far along with the project, we have got it all stitched out and we are ready to move on to the next step of preparing our pieces to cut and assemble to make our pillow wrap. So let's continue on with our project. Okay, we are ready now to go ahead and trim this piece. We're going to lay it out flat. Make sure that our stabilizer, our quilt batting layer, and our top layer are all laid out nice and smooth. You're going to get a long ruler and a cutting blade. And we're going to take and place our ruler along this line here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance of the ruler extended past this side. And our ruler is going to extend beyond the end up there just a little bit so that we can take and cut from here down. Then we'll move our ruler over this direction so we can cut the remaining part of it. And then we'll do the same on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here. So hopefully maybe you can see a bit of how this ruler lines up right on where that stitching line was, so that we've got a nice straight guide to utilize to cut with. Get that lined up and then go ahead and cut. Hold on to the ruler side firmly so it doesn't move, and then pull this fabric aside before moving this ruler at all, and then we're going to slide this down so the ruler extends beyond the portion close to you there. Line it up again on that stitching line, and then this remaining part, we're going to cut that off. Let's rotate our project around. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Again, lining up a 1/4 inch seam allowance on that stitching line that we did. When you've got that lined up nicely, go ahead, firmly hold that ruler in place and trim, and then move the fabric away. Slide your ruler down, line up again, and then trim off the remaining fabric. So now we've got this portion here cut. And now we're ready to start putting our side pieces on and our green little borders on. Okay, I have got my pieces cut and laid out. We've got 2 pieces here that are for the outside front border, and they are 2 3/4 inches wide by 32 inches long. And then we've got 2 inner cut border pieces that are 1 1/2 inches wide by 32 inches long. Now what I've done on this side is I've gone ahead and clipped the 2 pieces together. I'm going to move this over some so you can see. So I've got this green piece with the folded edge on the inside here, close to the edge here, with the wider border laid on top, and those are all clipped together. Now if it's too hard for you to maybe keep this piece in alignment along this edge with this one on top, what you can do is just lay the green one down first and clip just the green one into place and stitch it down. I would use a little less than a 1/4 inch seam allowance if you do that, so that when you go ahead and lay this yellow one down and stitch this one over top, you use your 1/4 inch seam allowance for this. Because if you stitch a narrower seam allowance here, it'll hold it in place so it doesn't move while you're stitching the yellow one down, but then it won't show through at all when we get the project finished. Now I also have taken the time to put a woven fusible interfacing on the back of this, because it's going to give the fabric this stability that it needs, so when it wraps around the pillow it's going to look nice and crisp. This here is going to be the backing, and we don't need to go ahead and use it on that, but you can see how that fabric there does not want to stay standing up at all where this one does. So even if it's just only on the front, it'll help give a nice finished crispness to your project if you don't use that woven interfacing. So take the time to measure and put some on here. So make a decision if you want to put both pieces here like this and stitch it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or if you want to do just the green piece or whatever color you choose for your skinny border and stitch that in place, and then go ahead and lay this one on and do a 1/4 inch seam allowance and stitch this in place, and then we'll be ready to go moving on to the next step. I have finished sewing my borders onto my project, and I have already pressed my seams back. So take an iron and make sure that you press these seams back so that it'll have a nice open flat area here for when we're going to finish up our project. I did not open these seams up. They just seem to really want to stay in this direction, so I left the inside or the back side seams just how they are there. Now, the next thing we're going to need to do is to straighten up the ends of our project here. So I'm going to move this over some, and then I'm going to take my ruler and my rolling blade, and I'm going to line up to make it straight. So if I follow one of the ruler lines here along this seam to make sure it's going straight this direction, and then close to the bottom here, look at where the shortest piece is and use that as a guide. And then I'm going to just take my blade here and trim this off so that we get that all nice and squared up and even. So that's all nice and straight on that end. Let's turn our project around and do the same for the other end here. Again, we're going to make sure it goes straight across this way, and you can see down here it's straight, and then now we've got those ends all nice and straight. Okay, I've got my ends trimmed up. I'm going to give you a couple of options of things you can do before we put the backing onto this project. If you want to, you can put this back in your machine quickly and do a little top stitch right along this edging here. That could help to hold this edge staying open flat. If you wanted, you can even use some fun decorative stitches that are built into your machine, and you can do a decorative stitch all along the edge here or right down the middle of the small border piece here. You can add a little decorative stitching to it. That's just one way to personalize your project for yourself. And if you choose not to do a decorative stitch, that's quite all right too. So the next step will be then to put the backing and the front pieces together. So what we'll do then is take our back piece, and we're going to go ahead and lay that down onto our table here. And then we're going to take our project piece and lay that on top. And we're going to want to make sure everything's flat, and I'm going to align this edge and this top edge, and there may be a little bit of an excess back piece here because of the seam allowance that we've sewn. So what you'll do then is trim up this excess around on your project, and then we're going to sew the whole project together. You'll leave about a 4-inch gap at the bottom part here. So after you've trimmed this up, then you'll put it in your machine and you'll sew. Starting here, sew all the way around your project and end over here, leaving that gap. Then you will take your project and turn it right side out. And make sure that you get those corners pressed out after you turn it right side out. Flatten it all out and then press it open. And then we'll be ready to do the next step to close up our project so it's ready to wrap around our pillow. So trim it up and stitch it together, and do that after you've done any extra decorative stitching you might choose to do on your project along the border piece. Okay, you should now have your project finished sewing together. You should have your front and your back pieces together and turned right side out. And that opening that was at the bottom along here, go ahead and hand sew that closed shut. And then we'll be ready to go ahead and start to measure how to wrap it around our pillow. We're going to have our pillow piece. We're going to go ahead and lay our pillow wrap over top of our pillow. I'm going to turn it over like this. And then what you'll want to do is, after you get this snug but not over snug, is pin it so that you can see where it's going to need to overlap to help you with placement for your Velcro. So I'm going to pin just below where it meets here, and then where it meets here I'm going to put a pin on the top part here because we don't want to pin it closed. Then I'll take a tape measure and measure from here to here to put the same distance on the other side, and from here to here the same distance on this side. Then I'll be able to take my Velcro, or if I want to do snaps or buttons, and then we'll take and lay our Velcro. You can do one long piece across here and sew it in place, or you can do two short pieces. And then what I would do then would lay this over and get an idea how far from there that I'm going to need to place the other half of the Velcro and stitch that along here. And then we will have a completed bunny pillow wrap project. Thank you for following along with me today in making this beautiful bunny pillow wrap project. I hope you enjoy making your project. Please leave a comment about what you thought of the project that we've made today. Bye now. Have a blessed day.